All right, guys, we're going to get started here in a minute. Well, welcome to Russia Christi, everybody. My name is Will Johnson. I'm the vice president here, student vice president. Just a couple announcements before we get started. So if you want to get on our email list, or if you're interested in becoming a member, you can talk to either me, Matt, or any of our staff here, and they'd be happy to help you with that. We've actually moved our officer elections that were coming up from April 7th to March 31st, so that's next Wednesday. So be prepared for that as well. And then if you are interested in buying the book that we're basing a lot of our talks off of this semester, it's $5, called Challenging Conversations. You can talk to Ben or any of us about that as well. But that's all I have, so without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker, Ben Blowers.
All right, due to changing rooms, that's kind of the awkward setup we're going to deal with. So hopefully my computer doesn't slide off the podium sometime this night if I get, dancing across the stage. So like Will said, officer elections are happening next Wednesday. So for those of you who are members of Ratio Christi, please make sure that you come, participate in that. And question? Oh, just waving. Okay. That's all right. Okay, so so make sure that if you're a Ratio Christi member, make sure that you attend next week so we can go ahead and elect our new officers for the following school year. I'm excited about the students who have stepped forward for that. So tonight, we're going to go over fundamentals of conversation, and I think this is going to be a quicker lecture. Don't time me, because I'm not sure how quickly I'll be able to get through it, but I'm hoping 25 to 30 minutes of lecture time, and then we're going to actually move into some discussion time as small groups. So this, for those of you who are online, this is where we'll have to bow out, and also incentive to show up here in person, because we have a lot of fun even off camera. But for those of you who are here in person, we'll go ahead and split up into small groups and do some discussion time implementing some of these fundamentals that we'll be learning in anticipation for future conversations, whether they're your everyday conversations or some more intentional conversations that we'll be hopefully orchestrating as the weather warms up, as we're able to be on campus a little bit more, and then moving into the fall, some evangelism opportunities, and then even for those of you who might be interested in the Utah trip, next year, or coming up here in about a month and a half, end of May, we'll be doing another Utah trip to Salt Lake City. So the sign up for that is April 1st. So if you're interested in making a last minute decision to go to Salt Lake City to do some evangelism training on the ground and interact with the members of the LDS Church, talk to me here real soon, and we'll get you the details on that. As kind of a quick overview of what we've done and where we're still headed, so we've actually switched around the order around a little bit from what we initially thought we were going to do. So we've done the conversational advocate, we did the formal and informal logic, or the formal logic and then the fallacies. And then we took a break while Wesley and I were in Utah, and Will taught on the problem of evil, which I heard was excellent. And then Wesley stepped in last week. Janae and I actually got stranded back in Salt Lake. Our flight was delayed a couple times, and so I didn't have enough time to prepare. So Wesley was my white knight, swooping in there and preparing a quick lecture, doing an excellent job last week on the Columbo tactic. Then we're going to do the fundamentals of conversation, and then next week it'll be Wesley again, going back to the Greg Kokel book, Tactics, and he'll be looking at how we can respond well to critics or skeptics who may become more difficult or who are more challenging simply to navigate the conversations with. And then we'll continue on with advanced conversational tactics and so on. I'm really looking forward to the session on the gospel, what it is and how to share it I think that's going to be very helpful for all of you. So tonight we're looking at the fundamentals, and Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay are the ones that I am referencing a lot from tonight. If you're interested, this is the book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, that I picked up about a year ago, and it's been very beneficial for me. They said, though, that conversations that remain civil empower you and change even the staunchest minds. Those conversations are possible, even across the deep divides. Right? It's possible to have conversations even when you disagree significantly with either the belief system that someone else has or the specific topic that you're discussing. But there are some important foundational strategies or goals or ideas that you should have in mind whenever you're entering into a conversation with someone. We're going to go over those here tonight. So real briefly, this is just kind of an overview of the 7 fundamentals, and we'll spend a little bit of time on each of them. This is what Boghossian and Lindsay outline in their book. So the fundamentals of conversation, you've got their goals. What are you actually aiming for? You got partnerships, rapport, the importance of building rapport, listening well. Shoot the messenger is a fun one. That's actually been very impactful to me over this last year. And then looking at our intentions, and then the need or sometimes the usefulness in walking away from a conversation. So jumping right in here, identifying the goals. This is important in a conversation, right? We're not having a lecture. We're not, if you remember from a number of weeks ago now, there are different forms of communication. You have lecture, you have teaching, you have coaching, mentoring. One of those forms is conversation, right? So when we're entering into that conversation, we need to identify exactly what the purpose of that communication or engagement with another person or a number of persons are, right? Sometimes we're simply looking to reach mutual understanding of another position, right? This may be more of a fact-finding type engagement or something where you don't understand another person or another person's position, and so you're going to seek to understand their position or where they're coming from, but you're not really looking to agree with them. You're simply looking to learn from them, which leads into the second one, learning. This can be more of a mutual, instead of simply seeking to understand what somebody else believes. Learning is actually learning from each other, right? Now we're not simply seeking to understand the other person's position, but you're actually seeking to gain information or gain knowledge that you didn't have from the other person, and then find out how the other person or your conversational partner arrived at their conclusions, right? This is, if you think back to last week when we talked about the Columbo tactic, right? You've got the 3 questions. Real quickly, do you remember the 3 questions in the Columbo tactic? Go ahead and shout them out. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? And Wesley knows. Anyone else? No one's gonna. Wesley, go for it.
Have you ever considered?
Have you ever considered, right? What do you mean by that? In other words, help me understand your position. Have you ever considered, or how did you come to that conclusion is really the background, right? Figuring out how they arrived at their conclusion. And then have you ever considered as a way to then introduce new information or your own position into the conversation, right? All 3 of those questions are implemented at multiple stages of any conversation that you're having, or they can be implemented and utilized well at any stage of a conversation. But another goal that we have is looking at truth. And this is often where I will try to go in a conversation, especially here in Utah a couple weeks ago. This is how I actually initiated a lot of the conversations with people I didn't know beforehand. I told them that I was in the area working with a number of students studying philosophy and religion, and I was interested in knowing true things and rejecting false things as far as I would be able to discern them. And so in the interest of finding truth, I wanted to know the other person's position, what they believed, how they had come to those conclusions, and see if those beliefs were compatible if they were true or false, and if they were compatible with what I already held as true. Right? So this is where I personally spend a lot of time, is often on that truth-seeking engagement in a conversation. Another goal you might have in having a conversation would be intervening. And so this would be something like attempting to change someone else's beliefs or behaviors, or even the methods of forming beliefs, right? So you're actually trying to interject yourself into their process of what they believe or how they have come to form their beliefs, and seeking to change it in some way. Another one, and this is, I would say these last two are less than positive reasons for entering into a conversation, but happen oftentimes. Impressing someone, right? So oftentimes I've found myself over the years where I'm in a conversation and I'm trying to show that I actually have a little bit of street cred, I actually know what I'm talking about, or maybe I've got some experience that I want them to know that I have. And so I will seek to impress the conversational partner or those listening, right? Those on the fringes, but I can tell they're kind of paying attention to the conversation. This is not a good way to enter into a conversation. It's going to lead to some problems, as we'll see here throughout the evening. And then finally, coercion. This is simply yielding to coercion or feeling forced to speak with someone. We've all been in those situations where maybe the context, maybe the situation that we're in, forces us into a conversation with somebody we don't know, or somebody maybe we don't like, unfortunately, or somebody that we're just uncomfortable with, or maybe it's a conversation about a topic that we're uncomfortable with. Yet we find ourselves in this position of having to make talk with someone and not enjoying the process, right? Sometimes those are the goals, or those are the reasons why we find ourselves in conversation. And oftentimes there can be multiple goals or reasons for the conversation occurring, happening at the same time, right? You can simultaneously be seeking truth, learning, and understanding the other person's position, right? You can be learning and understanding, but also seeking to intervene in someone else's belief system. So there can be multiple goals in a conversation that you're having, but it's helpful in conversations sometimes to actually articulate this to your conversational partner. Hey, I'm interested in learning more about your belief about fill in the blank, right? Or I'm really interested, like I gave an example, I'm really interested in finding truth. Would you join me in pursuing what is true and rejecting what is false, right? This can be a helpful approach to open up the conversation and allow someone who might be uncomfortable with the conversation, maybe you're both out of your comfort zone having a conversation about something, or maybe it's simply the fact that you don't know each other well. Simply stating, hey, here's what I'm hoping to get out of the conversation, what about you? Can actually be a really good way to create space for the other person, for the conversation to move forward effectively. So that's the first fundamental. Identify your goals. Understand where they're coming from, what their goals are in the conversation, and then seek throughout the conversation to fulfill those as far as you can. Secondly, forming partnerships, right? This is essential to having good conversations, right? Because forming partnerships requires a number of different aspects. I think foremost among those would be kindness, compassion, empathy, and treating individuals with dignity and respect, right? As I was writing through this, and like I said, this information is coming directly from Boghossian and Lindsay's book, but I recognized here that fourth reason, treating people with dignity and respect, is almost a verbatim pull from 1 Peter 3:15, which talks about always being prepared to give the reason for the hope that we have, yet doing this with gentleness and respect, right? Dignity and respect. Always understanding that the person that you're engaging with in a conversation, whether it's a healthy dialogue or it's an unhealthy dialogue that you're trying to withdraw from, it's always important to remember that this person is made in the image of God and is worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of how the conversation has gone up to that point or where it's headed. Right? Forming partnership is reliant on all four of those aspects: kindness, compassion, empathy, and treating individuals with dignity and respect. Secondly, you need to make your conversations safe spaces, right? Sometimes I've heard people joke, I've even made jokes about safe spaces and how sometimes we actually need to create spaces where we can have hard conversations. What I mean here about safe spaces is a conversation that you're having with someone needs to be a conversation in which they feel comfortable, or you've made it allowable for them to disagree, for them to back out of the conversation if they should choose to, for them to offer new information, or for them to maybe learn from you as well, or for them to teach you, right? This needs to be a place where you're not putting up barriers for the other person, but you're mutually moving forward to, while respecting each other, mutually moving forward toward the goal that you've kind of agreed upon. And sometimes these goals aren't always something that you've stated out loud, right? Although, like I said, it's helpful when you do that sometimes. But oftentimes, very quickly, you can start to identify very quickly what those goals are and begin to move toward those. An example that you might think of how to make this conversation a safe space for someone would be something like this, saying, can you help me understand how you've come to believe that, right? Or allow your conversational partner sometimes even to decline entering into a conversation, right? You can feel a conversation and all of a sudden, I don't know, something more controversial is coming up. Maybe it's, whether it's mask mandates or politics or religion or some other topic that people find uncomfortable. And you say, hey, you seem like you're a little on edge here, or you don't seem interested in this conversation. Is it okay? It's fine if you don't want to talk about that, right? Especially as we get into more personal issues with people, which you'll find as you begin to initiate conversations with people, there's going to be an openness to go at a deeper level or a more personal level more quickly. But be aware that people can become uncomfortable with a conversation and be willing to create a space for them to back out of that, right? And then finally, the difference between winning versus understanding, right? You don't want to enter a conversation like you enter a debate. A debate, you're seeking to win the debate, whether it's by the rules of the debate or whether it's by the forcefulness of the arguments that you're putting forward, right? But in a conversation, this is a mutual activity that two or more people are entering into of their own free will, right? And if one of you is winning, what does that mean? That means the others are losing. And that's not a healthy way of entering into dialogue with somebody. Boghossian and Lindsay put it this way. They said, ask yourself, not your partner, how could someone believe that? And do this honestly without incredulity. Ask yourself, man, this sounds like such an incredibly, whack idea. But how could they come to believe that? And you might discover that maybe there are some good reasons why someone believes that, even though the belief itself may not have good reasons backing it up. Does that make sense? You can differentiate between why someone holds a belief, and there can actually be some good reasons there, even though the reasons supporting the belief itself are not good. An example from here a couple weeks ago, when a member of the LDS church that I was talking with, when one of the students asked him, hey, have you ever considered that you're wrong? And what would happen if you found out you were? And he said, well, yeah, I have considered that, but honestly, the benefits of what I believe now outweigh what I see as the risk of believing otherwise. So for me to give up my belief, my religious beliefs, it's not worth it to me, because the family ties that I have through my religious beliefs are more valuable to me, right? He had a good reason, in the sense that it was a very compelling reason for him to believe what he believed, even though the things that we had talked about, he admitted had risen or had given rise to some issues that he saw as intellectual problems, right? But his reasons for continuing to hold to that belief in particular, it was helpful to understand that he was actually more relying on a familial tie, right? So it's important, ask yourself, not your partner, how could someone else believe, how does this person believe that? And can I seek to understand, or are there ways that I can illuminate that in the conversation? So, identifying your goals, forming your partnerships. Thirdly, building rapport. Right? This one's fun, because at first I mean, man, for the longest time, this was building rapport to me. And embarrassingly, that's how I said it out loud until it was pointed out, no, it's actually, it's a silent T. And it means to build rapport is to create a type of friendliness, a kind of friendliness in a conversation, right? You can see here, and I'll get into why I put these two particular pictures up there, right? But you need in a conversation to begin to build rapport immediately, right? The way that you might be able to do this is by asking easy questions, right? What is your name? Maybe starting with, hi, I'm Ben, what is your name? Do you mind if I interrupt you? If this is a conversation that you're having with someone you don't know, or you're initiating a conversation like we did out on the BYU campus here, we were initiating a lot of conversations with complete strangers on their way to and from class, right? And so I often would say, hey, do you mind if I interrupt you for a little bit? Acknowledging that I am inserting myself into their life, but doing so in a way that they can say, hey, I'm sorry, I'm really busy, I've got to go. And they can easily and graciously back out, and they don't feel like a jerk, right? Building rapport can sometimes involve exploring motivations and interests. So after you've established having a conversation with someone you don't know, or someone you don't know well, or someone that you've known a long time and you're simply driving the conversation or the relationship deeper, you can explore their motivations and interests. Hey, tell me about your dog. That's a really good one if you're talking to a dog person. Tell me more about your dog. How old? What's his or her name? Right? What kind? And those types of things. But you're seeking to find common ground with that person, such that you can just establish a form of communication that's low pressure, right? One of the easiest questions I think you'll ever be asked is, what is your name, right? Or here on campus, what's your major? For some of you, it may not be an easy question. For me, it wasn't for a couple years. But seeking to simply build a low pressure context of having conversation and communicating with somebody else. Don't parallel talk. This is really important. This was something that when I read this kind of hit me a little harder, because I found that this is something I do very easily. Parallel talking is actually what you see here in the bottom slide, where the individual, right on the left, he says, this summer my wife and I booked a vacation to Hawaii, and we plan to, and before he can finish out what his plans are, this lady jumps in. Charles and I have bigger plans this summer, and then she goes on, and we booked a flight to here, right? She started having a parallel conversation with him. I've done this so many times when somebody, goodness, there was one of you, I won't name who it was, but somebody who had the same major as me, which I was political science for my undergrad, started saying, hey, yeah, I'm in the political science major, I'm really interested. And I immediately jumped on that and was like, oh yeah, me too. I had this really good professor. And I started all of a sudden overbearingly taking control of the conversation, right? Instead of saying, wow, that's really neat, me too, building common ground, and then saying, what caused you to pick that major? What do you hope to do with that, right? Instead of jumping in and lending my experience, which is something we're all excited to do, we're all experts in ourselves, right? So the easiest way to take control of a conversation, start talking about yourself. The easiest way to make someone feel invited into the conversation, ask them about themselves, right? All of us love to talk about ourselves, and when you are the one creating the space for someone else to talk about themselves, they're going to get excited, they're going to get more animated just by nature, right? Moving through these, I'll move through some of these fairly quickly. Investing in spite of the differences, this is simply recognizing that you don't have to have all of your friends agree with you on everything, right? That's actually not a healthy place to be. A lot of people refer to that as an echo chamber, right? When all you have are ideas or beliefs or opinions that agree with you, it's just like an echo bouncing around. So investing in people who maybe you have differences with, differences of opinion or conviction, can actually be a healthy thing and actually makes you a more effective communicator yourself. Make the time to engage. Don't try to go deep into a conversation when you don't have the time to go deeper with that person, right? If you're just, a bump and run, and you see a friend you haven't talked to in a while, and hey, great to see you. Have you heard about the Kalam? I'd really like to tell you about the existence of God. And you buzz through the premises of the argument real quick, give them the conclusion, and say, therefore, you should believe in God. But sorry, I got to run, right, and head out. No, that would be an obvious instance where that wouldn't make any sense. But don't do this in conversation when you may only have a minute or two. As Wesley talked here last week, this concept of planting a stone in someone's shoe or putting a pebble in their shoe, an idea, a question, a simple piece of information that can be given in a very short amount of time that then causes them to think, causes them to consider maybe even that short interaction that you had. Janae and I were actually, after our trip wrapped up, we were at a tea shop and overheard a couple talking, and the only part of the conversation that really caught my attention was all of a sudden the guy says, yeah, that Christian religion, I just can't get behind it. I mean, how they believe that a God would send his own son and torture him for all, in the place of everyone instead of torturing all of those people for eternity. That just doesn't make any sense. Right? Of course, the apologist to me was like, that sounds like an interesting conversation. I'd love to be a part of that. So I actually approached the table and I said, hey, I'm sorry to interrupt. I couldn't help overhearing what you were talking about. This is something that I've been interested in as well, the little bit of conversation. And then I stopped myself and I was like, I'm sorry, I'm Ben, this is my wife Janae, and I was like, don't mean to interrupt, but this is something I'm interested in as well. If you'd like to, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on this. If you'd like to chat with me, I know this is a little weird, but here's my number, feel free to reach out to me. And they were very gracious and said, yeah, this is, we both came from, and they kind of gave their background, and it actually started a conversation. But I knew that I didn't have a time to sit down, pull up a chair, and dive deep with them. So I just said, hey, I'm interested in this stuff too. If you guys are interested in having a conversation with some strange dude who just walks up to your table at a tea shop, here's my number, making myself the vulnerable person in that situation. So make the time to engage. When you have the opportunity or when you're looking to have a deeper conversation, make sure you create enough space, create enough time in your schedule or even in the conversation to do that. Allow the conversation to end or to change. Again, I've kind of mentioned this a little bit already, but sometimes conversations come to an end, or sometimes people try to close them off or tie them off. Allow that to happen. Not every conversation has to go deep every single time. Don't call them out. This is something Wesley and I joked when we were trying to figure out a title for this semester. We joked about calling it Don't Be a Jerk semester, right? Learning how to converse well, learning how to be winsome in your conversations. And this is especially important in a conversation where someone might make, say, a logical fallacy, or they make a really bad statement or a factually unsound statement. Instead of just saying, hey, you just made an ad hominem, and that negates your entire argument, therefore your conclusion is flawed, therefore here's why you should listen to me, right? Don't do that. Find a non-confrontational way to point out that error if it's required in the conversation. Sometimes you can just allow those errors to go ahead and go on down the conversational stream, right? You don't have to call every single error, as I'm sure you would hope that others wouldn't call out every single one of your errors that you made in conversation. That can be very, very challenging to deal with. So don't call them out unless it's necessary, unless it's a really egregious error in the conversation where all of a sudden they started, maybe they're talking about a belief system that they disagree with, and they have this one super stupid friend who also believes this particular thing, right? That may be a chance for you to say, hey, hang on a second, I want to make sure that we're talking about the issue and we're not disparaging another person, right? We want to show even the people who aren't part of the conversation dignity and respect, right? So find a gracious way, maybe after the conversation, if this is an ongoing thing, or if it needs to be addressed in the conversation, then find a gracious way to bring it up. Do that with humility. But don't just immediately call them out and then try to move on. That's going to end the conversation very quickly. And then finally, This is Boghossian and Lindsay, both experts in their respective fields. But they said, be courteous, please, thank you, and comments like, you've given me something to think about, or I appreciate the way that you've engaged with me in this conversation, can go a long way in maybe creating a space for you to have a follow-up conversation with somebody, right? Or just simply being nice. This is something I think sometimes when we get into difficult conversations, we forget to be nice to one another. Listening well. Here I'm just going to go over a few things real quickly. Hearing versus listening, right? Hearing is a physical process of, someone breathing through their voice box, the molecules vibrating through the air, hitting your eardrum, you're being interpreted through the neurons in your brain, and then that's what hearing is, right? Listening is actually understanding, hearing with the purpose of understanding what is being communicated, okay? So that's just something to think about. A lot of times I've found myself hearing the conversation but not listening because I may be preparing my own comments, or I'm distracted by something that's going on in the background. It's important to make sure that you're listening in the conversation. Yield in the conversation. This is just the idea of those awkward moments where both of you start talking at the same time, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, no, sorry, you go. No, you go, right? Instead of just yield to them and say, no, I insist that you go. And if they say the same thing, then say, okay, here. And then you give your thought, and then you yield to them and say, hey, I interrupted you. I want to make sure you have an opportunity to share your thoughts as well, right? Just this idea of mutual kindness that creates space for effective communication. Attentiveness, body language, face them. Don't be turned away, right? It'd be super awkward if I sat here the whole time like this, right? My body language, right, tells you that something weird is going on, right? So when you're talking with them, now this doesn't mean you have to square up and stare them down, right? You don't need to be aggressive in your stance, but making sure that you're making eye contact with them, facing them, even having a pleasant expression. These are things that sometimes unconsciously, especially if we're having a more difficult conversation or something about a really intense topic, right? Our faces can get really, really serious. Just make sure that you are communicating in a way that says that, hey, I care about you and I care about the conversation that we're having. I'm engaged in that. Don't finish their sentences. Pause, allow for silence, right? Here a few weeks ago, I told you about the pregnant pause. I think a lot of you got very uncomfortable very quickly with silence in the room. Now, that's a little bit natural because this isn't a conversation, right? We're not having a conversation here. This is more of a lecture or a teaching opportunity. And silence isn't as comfortable when a speaker does it that you're coming to listen to hear from, right? But in a conversation, sometimes it's okay to allow for a couple breaths or something, just to allow people to collect their thoughts. That can be a very helpful approach in a conversation. Recognize and avoid distractions. I met with Tanner here earlier this week. We actually went out to dinner, and there were TVs everywhere. It was really difficult not to be distracted. I tried to sit with my back toward the TV that was almost literally right above our heads, and I ended up having 4 TVs out in front of me, right? As great as Tanner is, and he is a great guy, it was very difficult not to sometimes be distracted when the dude was doing like a windmill dunk over the defense, right? It was very distracted. Sometimes it can be helpful in a conversation. If you find yourself being distracted by something that's going on around you, just alert the person who's talking or that you're interacting with and say, hey, I'm sorry, I'm being really distracted by this event that's going on over here. Is this bothering you too? Do you want to go find a different spot? Or just so you know, this is distracting me, but I'm doing my best to stay focused. But if I have to ask you to repeat something, it's not you, it's me, right? So just acknowledge those distractions. Also asking for clarification if you don't understand something. This is in the process of listening, right? Ask for clarification. It's a way for them to continue to illuminate your own understanding in the conversation. And then acknowledge feelings that may be present, right? As a conversation proceeds, there are often times where people can become fearful or hurt or express anger or disgust, right? It's helpful for you to be able to recognize those, sometimes simply to adjust your interaction with them and respond accordingly. Other times, you can actually bring it up and say, hey, I'm sensing that you're getting a little bit upset here. Is it something I said, or is it just the topic? Because I want to make sure that I'm not offending you, right? The message can sometimes be offensive. This is something that Jesus said in a rough paraphrase. I'm offensive, how much more, or if I'm offensive, how much more will you be offensive in the message that you bring, right? Well, we should allow the message to be offensive that we're bringing if that's necessary, but we should never be offensive ourselves, okay? So sometimes acknowledge that maybe you have offended someone or you have caused a rift in the relationship or in the conversation. Acknowledge that that may have happened and seek to make amends through that. Interruptions, this is something that, as I was refreshing here for tonight, I don't think I picked up the first time I went through the book. They said, don't start where you were stopped. So if you get interrupted, right, and you go ahead and yield in the conversation, and they finish what they're saying, and then you start exactly where you got interrupted, what's that going to communicate to the other person? That's going to communicate that you weren't actually listening at all. You were just waiting for a moment of silence where you could interject your thought back into the stream of the conversation, right? So instead of doing that, if you do want to get back to what you're saying, maybe make a comment or a follow-up or acknowledge like, wow, that's really interesting. Here's what I was thinking here a moment ago. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. And then rephrase the thought or the point where you were being interrupted. It's a tactical maneuver in a conversation that can prevent offense or prevent some unintentional communication there. No phones. That's obvious. Oftentimes, if I do pull out my phone, say to look up a scripture passage or to Google something, I was talking with somebody here a couple weeks ago. We were talking about a definition or the distinction between pantheism and panentheism. Neither of us could remember the exact distinction between them. So I was like, hey, I'm gonna look it up here real quick. And he was like, cool. So I brought out my phone. That's an okay thing to do. Or if you're taking notes, just let them know, hey, I'm taking notes on my phone. Make sure that you're not texting your buddy. That's important. I hear you is simply a way, sometimes if you don't have words to respond, or they're sharing something more personal, or maybe more difficult. I've actually tried using this a few times with people, and it's been effective, simply in creating space for someone to share what they're dealing without me having the pressure of responding or formulating something, to try to make them feel better. Sometimes just saying, man, I hear you. It's a simple phrase, but that it can actually have great effect in a conversation because it acknowledges that you've heard them, maybe even just physically, but you're also just saying, yeah, wow, that does sound like a rough time, or whatever the situation may be. Just some tips there. This is one of my favorites. Shoot the messenger, right? Remember, that you're having a conversation, not a lecture. None of us likes to be lectured. That's what we pay professors to do. And so when you're in a conversation, you don't want to be lecturing or be the one receiving the lecture. One of the ways that you can do that, or you can kind of differentiate between those, is say something, just say to yourself, don't say this out loud, am I saying this? Or was I invited to say this? Right? If you're just saying this because you want to get your point across, you're probably simply delivering a message, and that can come across like a lecture, right? But if you were invited, yeah, then go for it. You can definitely say what you're thinking. But this really comes from a posture of humility, right? The idea of shooting the messenger is not that messages are bad, but when you're engaging in conversation and you're driving to a particular point, again, in conversation, and especially certain conversations, if you're simply waiting to get to your point, you're going to be missing a lot of the details, or maybe the nonverbal cues, or maybe some of the things that would actually help you understand where the person is coming from, because you're not really listening, you're simply hearing and waiting to get your message across, right? So in that sense, right, shoot the messenger. Stop trying to deliver a message. Now, Boghossian and Lindsay do take this farther than what I would actually take this in their book. They say that it's always wrong to bring a message or to deliver a message in a conversation. I would argue that no, there are certain conversations where you should bring new information to the table, but as a general rule, if that's kind of the way that you function in a conversation, that's going to be unhealthy, right? Don't debate unless it's planned. You don't want to just get into an argument where you're just trying to impress each other or trying to impress those around you. This is, again, a mutual effort toward a common goal, and debates generally aren't structured that way. There's a room there, and there's a place for a debate to happen, but you don't want that to happen or to arise in your conversation. Don't shoot the messenger is the idea. If you're the one who's getting delivered the message, right? Don't say, hey, you're trying to drive to a point in the conversation that I'm unwilling to go, you need to stop, right? That would come off as a jerk, and it would shut down the conversation pretty quickly. So this idea of shooting the messenger and don't shooting the messenger is applied to yourself, right? If it's yourself bringing the message, then maybe check yourself and see what the purpose, if that's going to be conducive to moving the conversation forward, or if it's going to hinder that. But if it's the other person, be gracious, treat them with dignity and respect, and then use your questions, right? How did you come to that conclusion? Or have you ever considered this additional perspective, right? Boghossian and Lindsay say shooting the messenger should only be a self-inflicted act. Take aim at your own messenger, i.e. you, not the other person, right? This isn't a tactic to shut other people down when you don't like what they have to say. All right, checking your intentions. This, again, don't assume that their intentions are always bad. Someone may have a very different perspective. They may come from a different political background or a different religious or ideological background. Just because that is the case, that doesn't mean that they're actually evil people, right? In the same way that just because you hold the beliefs that you hold doesn't mean that you're an evil person. Maybe on some of those beliefs it means you haven't thought very well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to be unkind in the conversation, right? So don't assume their conversations and be clear with yours. Say, hey, I'm interested in truth. I don't really care if you shred what I believe, because I want to know what's true, and I want to know what's false, and I want to be able to accept the true and reject what's false, right? That was an approach I used in a lot of conversations where they knew that I was disagreeing with them here a couple weeks ago. I was like, hey, you don't have to be worried about my feelings. You're not going to hurt my feelings if you try to shred my beliefs, because if it's wrong, I want to reject it. So I was very clear with my intentions. Remember from a number of weeks ago now, I think almost a month, curiosity versus cynicism, right? Be curious. Don't say, hey, I know how this conversation is going to go, or I've had this type of a conversation before. Be curious about the person you're interacting with. Remember that they're a person made in God's image and worthy of dignity and respect. Be honest with them. Don't feed the trolls. There are some people who are going to enter conversations who simply like to pick a fight. I've had conversations with these people before where they aren't interested in arriving at a true conclusion. They're not interested in teaching you anything. They're not interested in learning anything themselves, certainly. They're simply there to make you frustrated, and they enjoy it, right? I tried to look up whoever said, don't wrestle with a pig. You both get filthy and the pig likes it. Apparently, no one knows where that quote came from. But again, just to be clear, I'm not calling the other person pigs, right? It's an analogy. It's a rhetorical tool. But you don't want to simply engage in a conversation with people who are seeking to throw a wrench in the works, right? That's the time, as we're going to see here in a moment, that's the time to walk away and know when to do that, okay? Be willing to admit when you're getting frustrated. This can be very difficult for us, but if you're getting frustrated or if you're getting angry, Wesley, I think you brought this up last week. If either one of you gets angry in a conversation, you've lost, right? Maybe you didn't lose the argument, but you've lost the conversation, you've lost that interaction, you've lost the person who you're interested in actually pursuing truth with. So if you're getting frustrated, just admit that to them and ask them to help you understand better. Or if you're both getting frustrated and they respond poorly, right? You say, hey, I'm feeling that we're a little stressed out here, or we're getting on each other's nerves. let's just try to tone it down a little bit. And if they say, well, that's just you, sometimes it's helpful to say, well, I thought what we were talking about was, fill in the blank. And if that still doesn't go well, then it's okay to walk away, right? All conversations must and do come to an end at some point, right? This happens for a number of reasons. It might happen because you've exhausted the topic, or maybe you've reached an impasse. Maybe you're getting angry or they're getting angry. Maybe you've run out of time, or maybe you discovered that you need to do more research and study, right? Those are all reasons why, among the many, why a conversation might be coming to an end. And it's okay for that to happen. I've been in conversations, and I think you've probably been in conversations as well, where the person keeps on talking, and you've got to go to your next class, or you've got to get home, or you're just tired of the conversation and you really want to talk with someone else, right? It's okay to say, hey, I appreciate the conversation that we've had, but I've got to run. It's okay to do that. It's okay to walk away. Don't use all of your ammo is something I think Wesley and Janae and I saw when we were in Salt Lake. This was an important tactic that I think I've learned over the last year or so. Sometimes when you've prepared for a particular conversation or a topic, a conversation surrounding a particular topic, it can be our instinct to just pour on all the stuff that we've learned and all the stuff that we know and overwhelm them. But remember, all we need to do is leave a pebble in their shoe. We don't need to give them the rock slide, okay? We don't need to just unload everything we've got against their belief system or against, or about what we know about the topic. Sometimes it's okay and actually beneficial to hold back and say, hey, this is a really interesting conversation. I'd be interested in hearing more about what you've got to say on this topic, but I've got to run, or we've been talking for a while, I want to respect your time. Let's set up another time to talk later. And then how to walk away. Sometimes it's in some of the conversations that I was engaging in on the college campus there in Utah, the end of the conversation was the awkward time, right? I already gotten over the nervousness, and I was like, hey, I'm here with a group of students, and here's what we're studying, and can I talk with you? And they said yes, and we had a great conversation for 30 or 40 minutes, and all of a sudden it's like, all right, thanks, right? It can be awkward to figure out how to close off that conversation, especially if it's been a good one. Sometimes it's okay to just be like, wow, take a second, breathe, thank them for their time, thank them for engaging with you well. And then this is just more a recommendation to myself. Stop talking, right? Sometimes it's okay to be like, hey, have a great one, it's been good, and then walk away. It's okay to actually do that. Okay, so that was a lot of information to power through, and that was much more than my 30 minutes that I was aiming for. But I hope this was helpful. I know this is really basic. I hope that you guys were sitting there being like, man, I actually know all this stuff, and I do this very well. I hope that's your response, because that means you're being an effective communicator. You've already implemented some of these things. Maybe for some of you, there's a lot of new stuff. It's like, oh, wow, I hadn't quite thought about it that way, or there's something that maybe caught your attention you'd like to implement better. So we're actually going to take time. So for those of you who are watching online, we're going to sign off here in just a moment. And we're going to do some exercises here, actually practicing some of this stuff. So maybe some of you are all of a sudden going, oh, great, now I'm getting nervous. It's okay, that's normal. There was somebody here recently, they said, about those butterflies, right, when you're about ready to have a conversation with people. Those butterflies don't go away, but you can teach them to fly in formation. And so that's what we're going to do the rest of this evening. We're going to teach those butterflies to fly in formation a little bit more, implement some of the stuff that we've talked about. But before we close off here, are there any questions specifically about the content that we went over tonight, or something you need a little more clarity on? Nothing? Anything? Sure. Yeah. trying to think back to the conversation. I don't think I really gave them a position, a personal position, given the time frame, and we were actually waiting on we had to head out from that little tea shop like immediately as I started having the conversation. And so I was just like, hey, I know this is super weird, but I've asked a lot of these same questions. I'd be really interested in talking with you and hearing your perspective, because this is actually what I'm in the area, I'm from out of town. This is what I'm in the area doing. If you're interested, here's my number. I know I'm a super random guy, so that's cool. And they were very gracious about it. I haven't heard anything back from them, but yeah, I didn't even take the time to try to say, here's why I actually think it's not cosmic child abuse and so on, because I didn't want to insert myself too deeply into their discussion. Any other questions here? All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up here for the lecture portion. So thanks to those of you who are hanging out with us online. Matt, we don't have any questions from online? All right. So here's what we'll do. Let's go ahead. How many of you have someone in here who you don't know well, or maybe haven't had a conversation with at all? Go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, yeah, pretty much everyone. Go find one of those people who you haven't talked with, and go sit next to them, and let's do groups of 3. So I'll let you. So go ahead and get up a little for a moment. Go find somebody that you haven't talked to much or don't know well. So is everybody roughly in groups of 3? So go ahead and find